Agents of Mayhem is often remembered as a forgotten game, a new IP from Volition that came and went without leaving much of a mark. Most people wrote it off as a Saints Row spin-off that didn't quite land, and on the surface, that's a fair assessment. But what if the reason Agents of Mayhem failed had nothing to do with the game itself? What if Volition, the studio behind one of the most beloved open-world franchises of its generation, sabotaged their own game before it even launched? Because when you actually look at how Agents of Mayhem is built and marketed, it stops looking like a failed IP and starts looking like a game that was never given the chance to prove itself. Agents of Mayhem was supposed to give us something fresh. Set in an alternate universe created at the end of Get Out of Hell, the premise was simple. A brand new roster of agents, each with their own playstyle, taking on the evil organization known as Legion. You would upgrade your base of operations, your characters, and your weapons as you worked your way through the story. It was over the top, it was colorful, and it had enough variety in its combat to make each character feel distinct. And if Volition had committed to that vision fully, this could have been the start of something great. But the moment the game was revealed, it became clear that Volition wasn't fully committed to anything, because the issue started before the game even launched. The reveal trailer made it clear that this game was connected to Saints Row, and from that moment forward, nobody knew what to expect. Was this Saints Row 5 or was it something else entirely? And Volition spent the entire marketing campaign making sure that question was never clearly answered. Pre-order bonuses included Johnny Gat as a playable character. There was a DLC where you could recruit Kenzie, and one of the recruitable agents in the vanilla game is Pierce, who was running a gang in Stillwater. You could maybe write off Gat and Kenzie as fan service, but Pierce running a gang in Stillwater that's presumably the Saints isn't. That's a studio that didn't trust their new IP to bring in an audience on its own, so they used their old one as a safety net. The only problem is that it had the complete opposite effect. Volition was so focused on giving off the impression that this was another Saints Row game that they were genuinely surprised when people judged it as Saints Row 5. And it wasn't just the characters that made it feel that way. Almost everything about Agents of Mayhem feels like a Temu version of Saints Row. The driving mechanics feel familiar. The Saints purple is the primary color for Mayhem, and Mayhem even uses the Saints flower as their symbol. Volition built a new IP that looked, played, and felt like an existing one, and then they were confused when people judged it as that IP. And here's where it gets interesting, because up to this point you might be thinking, okay, Volition made some questionable marketing decisions, but bad marketing happens. Games survive this all the time. But the Saints Row problem runs deeper than bad marketing, because when you look at what Agents of Mayhem could have been and what it actually became, it stops looking like a series of poor decisions and starts looking like a studio that was too afraid to let go of the one thing that made them relevant. Because Agents of Mayhem isn't a bad game, it's mediocre, but it isn't bad. If you don't look too closely at the story, it's actually a pretty decent play, especially for the price you can get it for now. But as a Saints Row game, it falls apart completely. The constant reminders that this takes place in an alternate universe wouldn't be a bad concept for a new IP, as long as Volition made it clear that although this game exists in that universe, it has nothing to do with Saints Row. You can go ahead and throw a reference to Gat here and there, maybe have him make a brief appearance, but for the most part, leave the Saints characters alone. But Volition never did that. They made Pierce, Gat, and Kenzie integral to the experience, and it did nothing but work against them. If they wanted Saints Row 5, Agents of Mayhem was the wrong game to build it with. The story doesn't line up with what Saints Row 5 should have been, and honestly, Agents of Mayhem plays more like a mod for Saints Row 4 than a true successor to anything. If Volition wanted a new IP, they needed to fully commit to it. Instead, they sat on the fence, and from that very moment, Agents of Mayhem was always doomed to fail, and that completely reframes what Agents of Mayhem actually is, because this wasn't just a game that underperformed. This was a studio so afraid of failure that they guaranteed it. Volition didn't trust that a new IP could stand on its own, so they tied it to Saints Row, and in doing so, they made sure it would never be judged as anything else. Agents of Mayhem ended on a cliffhanger. It was clear that they did have big plans for this IP, but nobody would have come back for a game that essentially would have been marketed once again as Saints Row 1.5. And the real tragedy is that Volition never learned from any of this, because they repeated the exact same mistake with the Saints Row reboot, a game that doesn't even feel like a Saints Row game. It feels like they took a brand new IP and slapped the Saints Row title on it because they didn't trust it would succeed on its own. Same fear, same mistake, but different game. But this time it would cost them everything. The studio shut down in 2023 after the failure that was the Saints Row reboot. The studio that built one of the greatest games of all time, in my opinion, a game that could rival Grand Theft Auto, is no more. This studio, if it didn't fall into the mistakes it did, could have built something entirely new with Agents of Mayhem. But there's one thing that stopped them. They were never willing to let Saints Row go. Agents of Mayhem had the bones to be something great, and with a little bit more care, polish, and better storytelling, this could have been a new legacy for Volition. Instead, what we got was a game that tried so hard to be Saints Row and then tried to prove otherwise. And that there is a very messy formula. At the end of the day, people didn't judge Agents of Mayhem as its own game. They judged it as a Saints Row title, because that is exactly how Volition marketed. And look, this game, it isn't without its merits, but it just couldn't escape the Saints Row title. And ultimately, Saints Row is the very thing that killed this game and eventually the studio as a whole. But maybe the saddest thing about all of this is that Volition never realized that they should have let go of the Saints Row IP until it was too late. If you like this sort of analysis, consider subscribing, as it does help me build my channel. And let me know what you think about Agents of Mayhem in the comments below.